Is it true, Francis, that you always say champagne for my real friends and real pain for my sham friends when you make a toast?
That's just an old Edwardian toast I sometimes use. I spend so much time drifting from bar to bar, person to person. It seems to sum the situation up so clearly. And what more is there to life than to sum the situation up?
Yes,
clearly.
Of course. That is the only point of anything. And certainly, it is the point of art. I think the aim of art is to create a residue of reality, not to reproduce reality, but a reality of the same intensity. And it's also a way of trying to give existence some form of permanence. Of course you never achieve it. However much you try, I fail. Time after time, I fail. But in a sense, we're bound to. You may think sometimes you got a little closer, so you keep on trying. But here is the contradiction. There will be nothing worse than succeeding. Because afterwards, there'll be nothing left to do. I love London. I don't know why you don't come over more often. I mean, and not just to hang a big exhibition. I think London is so completely different from Paris. I mean, everything looks different. Even the trees in the park. And the people, they seem to inhabit a different space.
It's terribly nice of you to say that.
I mean,
I always think that Paris is so much more beautiful than London. So much more stimulating. I mean, it often feels terribly provincial and dreary here. And there's not much happening in the arts. I remember, I always used to long to see the latest issue of Cahiers d'Art, another magazine, simply to find out what was going on over there, what you were up to, what Picasso was up to.
I mean, I went into your gallery today, and I must say that your paintings, which radiates vitality, besides my things at the Tate will look as though they've been done by an old spinster.
Nothing could give me greater pleasure than to hear you, who I consider to be the greatest living artist, say that about my work. I'm hugely, deeply touched. I've admired everything you've ever done. Your whole attitude towards life and art. From the beginning, it's not just what you've created, but it's the way you live. I've always been struck by those photos of you in your studio with all that marvelous mess strewn over the floor. I live in that way too, because I find having all that chaos around me, it stimulates ideas as you work. I've got so many photos and things piled up like a great compost heap, and every time I walk up to the canvas, I kick new images up, and they act like triggers for ideas while I'm painting. And all the painters I know in London, like Lucian and Auerbach, they look up to you as a great artist, one of the greatest figurative artists of our time. You've been a model for us all, particularly now that art is only interested in abstract.
Me, I'm no model.
Do you remember, before Isabel introduced us, I saw you sitting at the floor in the Saint-Germain, and it must have been the early 50s, and I felt I had to come over and say to you that to me, you were the greatest sculptor and draftsman of our times.
And what did I say?
What terrible times we must be living in. But nobody's managed to convey so much about what it means now to be a human being as you have in those marvelous drawings. You managed to sum up so much in a single stroke. You even managed to sum up the air, the space, the atmosphere surrounding each person. I've never been able to do it, especially because I can't draw. I've never been able to. I don't know why. I'm sure it's one of my limitations. I go straight to the canvas and hope that as I splash paint down, it will somehow suggest to me how I can achieve these images that keep dropping into my brain like slides.
It must be wonderful to work like that, really. I'm not really interested in the actual process of making the object. I mean, I'd as soon make a maquette in plaster, sketch out an idea, and then I'll have someone else, like a technician or an artisan, make it into a sculpture. And I'd be so delighted if someone else could do my painting for me. I just want to see this thing I had in mind actually produced. Then perhaps I'll make a few alterations to it here and there. But I couldn't begin to do anything without drawing it first. Yes, I mean, drawing is the basis of everything I do. I draw to try to understand what I'm looking at, even if when I'm drawing I feel like a man groping his way through the dark. But for me, it's the only way I can grasp what's in front of me, even if it's a glass like this one. I mean, or a nose on someone's face. It sounds odd to say that I can't even draw a nose, but it's true. When I look at it, it just seems to dissolve or to become so enormous and strange, like a pyramid, that I don't know how to begin even to suggest it.
Well, it may be that my images are often slapdash, and they probably are, even if I do try to make them what I call deeply ordered. I mean, I occasionally do make little sketches in thin paint before I start on a canvas, but they're only the briefest points of departure, like situating the figure that I'm going to try to do. I often have the image I want to do very clearly in my mind, but until I begin, I have no idea how I'm going to achieve it. That's the whole mystery of painting for me, and the whole excitement. What I'm always hoping to do is have a great wave of instinct and make these images come off my nervous system as directly and immediately as possible, or with all their freshness clinging to them like foam. Almost never happens like that, of course, but that's another story. I dreamed once I had a fish in my hand, and I thought, if only I could slap it into the wet plaster on a wall with all its bones and everything inside, I'd have the perfect painting.
For sure.
I only paint for myself. I only paint to excite myself by trapping these images that sometimes just seem to well up in me one after another.
Yes, well, you can only work for yourself. I mean, my only reason for drawing and so on is because I want to understand the world around me a bit better. I don't know what other people, spectators, will make of what I've done. I never think about it. But I'm sure that people who look at my work or buy my work are interested in it for completely different reasons than me. I mean, for one thing, no work I've done is ever finished, as far as I'm concerned, because I always feel it could be improved or taken further, even if it's already gone into an exhibition. But for the spectator, it's a completely finished work. And of course, I can't go around the museum or gallery telling everyone it's not finished, can I?
That's the thing.
And then another difference is that I am as interested in the failed and destroyed piece I make as the one that go into exhibition and is bought. Because they're all failures, really. Some perhaps more than others. But it doesn't matter to me because I think of failure as inevitable. And if I ever really succeeded, it would be the worst thing in the world. It would be the end, like death or something even more terrible.
I always aim to make that one great image that will cancel out all the others. But you're right, if it happened, it would be a catastrophe. Because there would be nothing left to live for. I've always thought that if I didn't have my work, I'd just be a crook or a gangster, drinking myself to death. That one great image won't actually come about because you can't will these things into being, particularly in my case, because when I'm painting, I leave as much as possible to chance, or what I like to call accident, which is very important to me. And I don't think chance or accident could possibly work for me in the way that I hope for if I'd done a whole lot of preparatory images. So I just go along like a fool in the hope that as I put the first brushstroke down, it will suggest others, that all these images, that the paint itself will suggest others and indicate and keep indicating and engendering new forms and new possibilities. That's what I love about oil painting, because it's so endlessly fluid and suggestive. And sometimes when things are going badly, I just put a stroke right through the image I'm doing just to obliterate it, and suddenly it comes alive. And I can see how to make it work.
Yes, I mean, Francis, I know you are a great gambler in life as well as painting. You know, what has always impressed me is how scale can change everything we see. Like the little people walking on the opposite side of the street when you're sitting in one of those cafe terraces, and how you convey this dramatic difference when you're drawing, painting, or modeling your memories about them. I was going to meet Isabel one night on Boulevard Saint-Michel, and I saw her from far off, standing against a huge door and a dark building behind. And she looked so tiny and vulnerable that I've never forgotten that moment. So I could have put her on a huge plinth to suggest a sense of scale, but I wanted to stay close to that first sensation. And as I worked to capture all of that in my sculptures began to diminish in size.
Particularly always admired your very tiny sculptures.
For me, the simplest things can be the most memorable. I mean, this glass in front of me, in a certain light, can be the most memorable thing in the world. Like some magnificent palaces in India. I could copy it for the rest of my life without ever really penetrating its mystery. Everything has mystery for me. I think I could spend the rest of my life throwing the same glass over and over again without ever exhausting the subject or even defining it once and for all. Oh, and then, if you think of the face of someone who poses for you every day, whom you've tried to capture every day, when you see something new, something unforeseen appear on that face, it's like the greatest adventure, the greatest discovery in the world.
You're right, the face is simply an inexhaustible subject.
You know, I was watching the news in a cinema in Montparnasse not long after the war, and suddenly all the images in the screen turned into black and white blobs dancing around me, and they had no interest at all to me. But when I looked at the people sitting around me, they seemed so incredibly fascinating and present, even overwhelming, like huge presences I'd never probably noticed before. And so did the trees and the streets. And when I came out of the cinema to Boulevard Montparnasse, everything looked as if I'd never seen it before. As if I was seeing the world, discovering the world for the first time. As if I'd been looking at it through screens before.
I think what you've just said is very profound, Alberto. In a way, we all live screened existences, and when people complain, as they do, that my paintings are violent, I think it's merely that I've been able to clear some of those screens away and show life as it is. People complain about cruelty, about bullfights and things, as they eat their steaks and lamb cutlets and stand around in their fur coats with dead birds and feathers and things in their hats. So illogical. I mean, life itself is so cruel and violent. You only have to open a newspaper to see how cruel every day is. All I'm trying to do is convey a certain level of reality.
There is violence in everything, in sculpture, in life itself, as you say. You know, when I'm drawing a head, I am constantly astonished by all the violence it conveys. It requires such huge reserves of energy to exist, just to live, that it radiates violence. That's understood, but then on top of that, you have to ask yourself what that reality you mention is. So you might say that if I manage to copy this glass in front of me, with its exact shape and the way the light falls on it, that's reality. But even then, you never actually copy the glass. You simply copy the residue of its appearance in your eyes as you look at it from every angle, from a distance or up close. And then again, it's impossible even to copy the way you see it, because that changes all the time. You get closer or further away. Well, sometimes I think I live entirely in my own reality, which is quite separate from anybody else's reality. And that's why I have to try to understand it, to get a grip on it, in order to nourish myself, to protect myself, to survive.
Well, this is the thing, Alberto. We do what we do to survive. I wouldn't let anything out in my pictures if I didn't have to live. It's only by painting that my life has any meaning. I adore life, even if I think of it as meaningless. After all, from birth to death, we simply drift from nothing to nothing. And I think only by our drives, by our passions, by our appetites, do we give any meaning at all to existence.
You talk as if you once believed, perhaps as a child, that life had a meaning. And then you were disappointed when you found out that it didn't. I think I've always remained a child. I think I haven't really changed much since I was a boy. But somehow I never expected anything. I was too obsessed by trying to understand what I saw immediately around me to search for any other meaning. But now I really hate when I'm called an existentialist, as if I belong to some philosophical school. I don't belong to anything. I barely belong to myself. I'm just trying to understand.
You're absolutely right. Of course, you know there are very few real artists. They stay close to their childhood sensations. And I agree that calling you an existentialist is ridiculous and totally beside the point. It's the same thing for me. People keep saying I'm an expressionist, whatever that means. But I'm not. After all, I've got nothing to express. I actually loathe expressionism with all those ghastly puddles of paint. I actually think, if I think about those things at all, that I'm a realist. I'm only trying to make my sensations about life come back to me with more poignantly.
And realism has become a dirty word nowadays.
In the end, I've been influenced by absolutely everything because I've looked at everything and it's all gone in and been ground up by my very fine imagination. I mean, I've looked enormously at Egyptian sculptures and things because I think of them as the greatest art man has ever made. I've also looked at prehistoric art, at the great masterpieces of the Renaissance, at Rembrandt's self-portraits, Manet, Degas, and of course Van Gogh. And I've done a series of popes after the Velázquez portrait of Pope Innocent X, which I think is the greatest portrait ever made.
Yes.
Even if the things I did didn't really work at all, and I have to say I'm a bit ashamed of them now. But you've looked at the whole of art too. One says there's the presence of the great masters right through your work.
Of course, how else would one learn or have any idea of what to do? You have to acquire some sense of the rules, even if you're going to break them.
Especially if you're going to break them.
Absolutely. And as our writer friend Michel Léris said once, if there are no rules, there is no game. And painting, after all, is a deeply cultured activity. You have to know what has been done in order to do anything now. And even as a child, because my father was a painter, I was aware of all kinds of art, and I began copying all kinds of things, from Assyrian art to Giotto and Dürer. I must have copied things in the Louvre 50,000 times. It was a kind of an obsession. And like you, Francis, I also copied that marvelous portrait by Velázquez, because I agree, it's one of the finest portraits in the world. But nowadays, the young artists all think that's very passé, that you shouldn't copy at all, but be totally original and reinvent everything like the surrealists.
Well, just to go back to what we were saying, people often talk about surrealism in relation to my work, but I don't like being branded as surrealist any more than an expressionist, even though it's true to say that I was a very young man and spent a bit of time in Paris. Surrealism was all the rage then. And it did open me up to new attitudes and ideas about life as well as art. And it taught me a lot about the importance of technique, how technique and subject had to be interlocked to become completely inseparable. I think that Surrealists had all the more effect on me because there was nothing of that kind of intellectual upheaval, with all its challenges to tradition, its desire to renew, going on here in London. For somebody who'd seen little of life, having been brought up on a horse-breeding farm in Ireland, you can imagine what an impact the whole surrealist thing had on me.
Yes, of course.
By the way, how lucky you are to have someone like Michel Léris and Sartre and Genet writing about your work. We have nobody of that quality here, I'm afraid. I've often thought how marvellous it would be to have someone really tearing into your work, telling you what to do, rather like Pound, when he pruned and edited Eliot's poems.
Yes. Well, Léris is a very old friend, but he's too modest to make a critique of my work. Perhaps that's why we stayed friends. Sartre, of course, wouldn't think twice about it, but I don't think he's got much of an eye. Genet, on the other hand, has a real sense of what I'm trying to do, and his book about my studio is unusually perceptive. And anyway, the surrealists dominated the early part of my life in Paris. I got caught up with them in the late 20s, and like you, I'd come from a very different background. I mean, imagine going straight from an isolated village in the Swiss mountains to the inner circle of Montparnasse in its heyday. I mean, most of the surrealists were about my age, and very bright and charming, full of mad ideas about how everything could be changed and reinvented. And I liked most of them personally, not just the painter like Ernst or Miro, but also the writers like Éluard, Crevel, and even Breton. And through them, I got to know a whole side of Paris. Collectors, decorators, dealers, society people that I probably wouldn't have come across otherwise. And that helped me a great deal. Jean-Michel Franck asked me to do decorative objects for his clients, which meant that Diego and I managed to...
for a decorator, and the best one in Paris. Well, When I started out, I did something very similar. I did designs of carpets, chairs, things. They were all very derivative. Now I wish I haven't done them, but I'm sure your decorative objects would have been much, much better.
Yes, so since I was in contact with the surrealists the whole time, I absorbed a lot of their ideas. I started doing a completely new kind of sculpture, full of wild fantasies and sly references. But I was showing off. I was proving that I could do things as weird, perhaps even weirder, as any other artist in the group. And this went on for several years until I'd realized I'd taken the wrong path. That none of it made sense, that it was no more than masturbation, and that I needed to get back to working from life. Of course, Breton didn't like all that. And one day, he and some of the others lured me into a meeting and formally kicked me out of the movement. The Pope of Surrealism excommunicated me. Well, I lost quite a few good friends, which I regretted, but in a sense, it was the best thing that could have happened.
I must say, it must have been marvellous to meet all those people. For some reason, I hardly ever seem to find people I can really talk to. I suppose it's partly because I find intellectual people so boring and ineffectual. And with my kind of gilded gutter life, going from bar to bar, person to person, I rarely meet really intelligent people. I'd love to meet someone who dominated me, both mentally and physically, a kind of Nietzsche of the football team. But I'm afraid it's very rare. Now, I'm not saying that George is Nietzsche of the football team, but he does have the kind of physique, the kind of muscular, male voluptuous that I love to paint.
Yes, I like George very much.
I'm so glad you liked him. I'm very fond of him. I only wish he'd learned something, because, as you know, he used to earn his living by breaking into people's houses and stealing. Unfortunately, he was always getting caught, so he spent a good bit of his life in prison. I'm trying to take him out of that life. He's very good with his hand. I've tried to get him to learn a trade like gilding, which I believe is very well paid. But of course he prefers to go out getting drunk instead, which sounds a little odd, coming from a drunk like me. But even when I've been on the drink for days, I know I have to work, even with a bad hangover, which sometimes makes my mind crackle with electricity. But George has nothing to do. I even tried to get him to learn French, but of course that was a total washout.
Send him to me in Paris, Francis. I'll get him speaking French, and my brother Diego will find him some work to do, perhaps some stands for sculpture. It would be a pleasure to help George. Perhaps I've fallen for him like you. You know, when I'm in London, I always feel homosexual. You must take me sometime to what you call your queer clubs, because I'd like to see what goes on there. I love places where people go for sex, because they have a special atmosphere. Of course, we have the famous Sphinx Club in Paris, where I used to go sometimes at the end of the evening, because I knew a few of the girls there. And I just could simply sit there and watch them, which I loved, and make drawings and even sculptures of them, because they have such an extraordinary presence there. And, you know, they're perfectly happy if you bought them a few drinks. And if you want something more, you just pay them what they want, and that's an end to it. They don't start clinging to you as often women do. My life with Annette has become much easier, much freer, now that she has an apartment of her own and a lover of her own. Did I tell you about this girlfriend I have? Caroline, who comes to my studio to sit for me regularly, and she's a marvelous model for me. Of course, Annette knows about her. And she's not at all pleased, so I try to make sure they never come into contact. But last night, Caroline just turned up out of the blue at the little hotel Annette and I are staying near Victoria Station. Well, she's gone now. As quickly as she came. And I don't even know why she made the trip.
Lovers do get very possessive. I used to know a man called Peter Lacey, who I painted a great deal at one point. He'd had his nerves shot apart by being a Spitfire pilot during the war. He used to make the most impossible scenes, beating me up, destroying my work. He'd go mad at times. We were on a longboat trip once, and he always thought I was what's called making eyes at the stewards, who are always queer on those kind of luxury boats. So he pushed all my clothes through the porthole. I had nothing left, not even a pair of shorts to wear. But there it was. I was obsessed by him. It was as the song says, you can't live with them, you couldn't live without them. So we had these 3 years of absolute hell together. And then, when the exhibition of mine opened at the Tate, along with all the congratulatory telegrams, I received one that told me that he'd just died in Tangiers, but it was a kind of suicide. He drank so many bottles of whiskey a day that his pancreas exploded.
It's true that falling in love can get you into terrible situations. Caroline has all these connections with the underworld in Paris, and some of the people she knows are real gangsters. We were in a bar not long ago when these men she knows came in with guns, everybody in the place stacked under the table, and then they shot all the bottles and mirrors in the bar to pieces. I think they were giving someone rather a warning. It was very impressive. Anyway, I always give her friends all the money they ask me, and then they leave us alone, at least for a while. I was really happy to see Isabel again at dinner this evening. She still fascinates me, and I've never met any other woman like her. She's a wonderful friend, and we just seem to pick up at the point where we'd last met at the Coupole in Paris. She was also a wonderful model for me, even though I felt quite intimidated by her reputation as a man-eater.
Was a woman-eater as well, if the affair with Balthius' wife is anything to go by. But Isabel just has this extraordinary vitality. She's sort of omnivorous, whether it comes to men or drink or God knows what else. People tend to think of women as dainty, but Isabel is tougher than most of the men I've ever met. But of course, then once you get to know a man, most men are weak.
Yes, we are all weak, Francis. Man is a kind of aberration, especially if you compare him to something like the trees that are all around us. Recently, I've been drawing trees for a book about Paris, a book called Paris Without End that Theriault wants to publish. And I'm struck by how self-contained and majestic they are. I only need to see one tree. That's quite enough. Already 2 trees are too much. So now I would never take a walk in the forest because it would be too much, too overwhelming. Just as I wouldn't want to see one more than one glass. One glass poses too many problems. What is comforting anyway is that trees don't need any answers because they have no questions about their existence. They simply are. We'd all be better off as trees, really.
Well, I'm not sure I'd really want to be a tree, Alberto. Whenever I'm surrounded by trees and what's called nature, all those things singing outside your room in the morning, I just can't stand it. I long to be back in the city with streets and people, just to walk along the streets and see people going about their rounds.
I'm only really at home in cities too. I used to walk around Paris late at night with Sam Beckett, usually after we'd drunk a few whiskies, in bars like Chez Adrian or the Rosebuds. And we were going down past Montparnasse Cemetery once, and he suddenly cried out, "I can't look at trees any longer." And I said to him, "That's because you love them too much."
I've often wondered about Beckett. I mean, he's meant to be so profound about man's condition and so on, but I've never really seen the point of all those tramps sat on stage in dustbins, endlessly talking. I've known plenty of those down and outs and bars in Soho. I don't need to see them on the stage.
I did a very bad plaster tree for a production of his Waiting for Godot a few years ago at the Odeon. And I don't think it worked. And I don't think Beckett thought it really worked either. But like me, he accepts failure. He accepts that everything we do, however hard we work at it, it's bound to fail. Fail again, he says somewhere. Fail better. And I think that's where he's clear-sighted and profound.
Of course. We do fail.
Yes.
We always fall short. What makes me come back to the canvas time and time again, even though I feel like I've done nothing but one failure after another, is the idea that I might do one image that will obliterate all the others. I have this absurd optimism, even though I know it's an impossibility.
I think you've come very close, Francis. Some of your new portraits, those of George, for instance, that I saw today, are stronger than anything I have seen in years. Really, they carry a freshness and vigor that no one else in your time has achieved. And somehow, by constructing those kinds of cages around your figures, you make them doubly vivid and powerful. You are the greatest living artist.
You can't say that.
Oh, you are.
Alberto, of course. I'm hugely, deeply touched, but it's you whom I've admired, who's been like a god to me over the years. Not only for your search for the truth, but your whole vision. You've created the way you've lived, completely dedicated to what you do. It's you who is the greatest living artist. No. I don't even compare.
No, I have to say it once more, and I want to be quite clear. It's you, Francis, who's the greatest living artist.
It's you. It's always been you.
What was it, Francis? Champagne for my real friends.